Thank you for that really sweet introduction, Alice, and thank you all for being here, both in person and online. I'm really excited to share the research that I've been doing over the past few years, and so let's dive right in. So temperature and precipitation are important drivers of ecological processes from the local up through global scales. They determine biomes, seasons, and species distributions. We know a lot about the effects of temperature on organisms. As individuals are exposed to temperature extremes, they experience physiological stress that threatens their survival and reproduction. We also know a lot about how precipitation affects plants. If they experience too much or too little moisture, they're unlikely to survive or reproduce. And I think we're all familiar with this concept because we've all had a few houseplants that look something like this. But we don't know much about the effects of precipitation on animals, particularly birds, because precipitation variability can affect not only their survival and their reproduction, but also their movement. So there are some studies that try to address this question, but they all document different responses to precipitation, whether those are negative, positive, or curvilinear. Also, most studies evaluate different metrics of precipitation. So when we study temperature, we often use averages, highs, or lows. But when it comes to precipitation, there are countless ways to summarize these metrics. So we can summarize them based on a variety of timescales, like annual precipitation, seasonal precipitation, daily precipitation, or even precipitation in previous years. We can also characterize precipitation in different ways. For example, total precipitation, mean precipitation, precipitation events like flooding or rainstorms. We can also use precipitation indices like El Nino that incorporate multiple axes of weather. So ultimately, we lack consensus on the effects of precipitation on bird populations because there's a huge amount of variability in how we measure and interpret these responses. So the overarching question of my dissertation is how and why does precipitation affect bird populations? And we have multiple hypotheses about how precipitation might influence bird populations involving both direct and indirect mechanisms. So precipitation may make thermoregulation more difficult because when feathers get wet, they often lose their ability to fluff up and keep birds warm. Birds might also experience physical destruction in response to precipitation. For example, nests can get washed away or get soggy. There are also potential indirect mechanisms, so precipitation can influence vegetation structure, therefore affecting refugia for birds and their young. Alternatively, precipitation could influence predator or prey abundance. And of course, this is an oversimplification because there are many potential interactions between all of these mechanisms.
Sorry, there's been a request to turn this towards you.
Oh. Really close. Okay. And each of these mechanisms might elicit different relationships with different vital rates, such as reproduction, survival, and movement. And even within a given vital rate, like survival, responses may differ depending on the time of year. So all of these responses that we see at an individual level drive the variation we see in vital rates and local population sizes each year. And ultimately, these responses influence species distribution. So processes that we see on local levels create these large-scale patterns. And my dissertation chapters tackle these relationships at multiple scales. So for my first chapter, I'll share a project in which I studied the effects of precipitation on avian nest success at a global scale. I examined one vital rate at a broad spatial and temporal scale. And then my other 3 chapters investigate a broader suite of vital rates on a local scale in the tall grass prairies of Kansas. So my second chapter investigates the relative contributions of each vital rate to overall population growth. And then my third and fourth chapters investigate the drivers of survival and movement. So my first chapter, I focused on how precipitation affects avian nest success because relationships between precipitation and avian nest success have been reported through the mechanisms that I've already outlined, but we lack an overarching understanding about how and why precipitation might affect birds and the relative importance of each mechanism. So I'll provide an example of this issue. So let's consider how precipitation might affect tree swallow nest success. Tree swallows are small migratory birds that are relatively abundant throughout North America. And there are several studies that have tested the relationship between precipitation and nest success. So in 2011, Hallinger and Crystal found no effective rainfall on avian nest success. In 2015, Beck and co-authors found a positive effective rainfall on hatching success, but a negative effective rainfall on fledging success. In 2019, Godwin and co-authors found a negative effect of rainfall on hatching success and a negative effect of rainfall on fledging success. And then in 2022, Wheelwright and co-authors found no effect of rainfall on hatching success and a negative effect of rainfall on fledging success. So how do we make sense of this information? There's no simple answer to how precipitation affects tree swallow nest success. It seems like it just depends. And my goal is to figure out what it depends on. So are there environmental or species specific characteristics that drive these patterns? And is there any way we can predict how a population might respond to precipitation? So in published studies, yeah.
You weren't sharing your screen
Okay.
apparently. So sorry to interrupt.
Did that do it?
I think it's from Zoom. Zoom.
Click the Zoom app and then go share
Click-
screen.
Yeah. The same. Zoom.
There's also display settings. I teach in here and I got trouble with this.
Okay.
So under the display settings at the top, after you share screen,
Mhm.
Have it duplicate your screen so that it eliminates, if you can, if it eliminates the notes, but that should let it advance, I think.
Okay. So I thought I had to do presentation mode and then share. Is that right?
Alt tab.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I did. Okay. Okay, can you guys see it now? Okay, good. Okay.
Start over.
Okay, I will start this slide over though. So in published studies, the relationship between precipitation and nest success has been reported via all these mechanisms. So I tested a series of predictions to see the relative importance of these mechanisms. So first, I expected that precipitation timing would help differentiate between direct, sorry, this, get rid of this thing. So first, I expected that precipitation timing would help differentiate between direct and indirect responses. So if precipitation directly influences nest success, I expected that nest survival would decrease in response to direct precipitation, because both thermoregulation and physical destruction represent costs or consequences of precipitation. Okay. Next, I expected if indirect mechanisms drive these relationships, I expected nest survival would have a positive or curvilinear response to precipitation, because rainfall could increase plant biomass or affect predator and prey populations over longer timescales, ultimately influencing these complex ecological relationships. Also, birds fall along a spectrum of how developed they are when they hatch. So some birds have altricial young that are born and they're relatively helpless. Their eyes are usually closed. They need a lot of parental care and they don't have a lot of feathers. Whereas precocial young, like in geese and ducks, they're born with feathers and they can almost immediately walk or swim. So if precipitation influences nest success via thermoregulation, then I would expect species with altricial chicks to have more negative responses to precipitation. I would also expect smaller birds to be more negatively affected by precipitation, because large animals thermoregulate better in general. And that birds that live at high elevations would have more negative responses, because higher elevations are colder than lower elevations. Birds also fall along a spectrum of parental care. So in some birds, one parent takes most to all of the parental care duties, and in others, both parents share that responsibility. And in some species, there are additional helpers that help raise the young. If there are helpers beyond the nest parents that attend to a nest, we call this cooperative care. And I would expect having more nest parents would increase the amount of time that a nest is being incubated, therefore keeping it warmer. It would increase defense of the nest from predators, and it would increase the amount of food that is brought back to the nest. So if thermoregulation, predator abundance, or prey availability mediate this relationship, then I would expect species with only one nest parent to have more negative responses to precipitation. Birds also nest in a variety of structures, from minimal nests like common nighthawks that just lay their eggs on the ground, to cup nests like in many songbirds, to more protected nests like cavity nesters. And I expect the type of nest structure that a species uses would affect its susceptibility to weather and predators. So if thermoregulation, physical destruction, or predator abundance influence this relationship, I would expect that species with minimal nests would have more negative responses to precipitation. So along with the structure of the nest, I also expected that nest height might influence these responses. I would expect that ground nests would be more susceptible to depredation and physical destruction, like flooding, therefore responding more negatively to precipitation. So also, if physical destruction influences these relationships, we might also expect biome to affect nest success. So for example, in aquatic biomes like coasts and wetlands that already have a lot of moisture in the system, they might be more likely to flood following rainfall. Or biomes that have plant communities that are responsive to precipitation, like grasslands, will respond more positively to precipitation than other biomes like forests. And finally, if prey availability mediates this relationship, we might expect specialist and general species to have different responses to precipitation. So to test these relationships, I conducted a series of meta-analyses. Essentially what this means is I created a data set from published literature. I systematically collected published sources relating to precipitation and nest success. So in April of 2020, when it was looking like we were going to be inside for a while, I searched some scientific databases and retrieved 3,000 sources. And as I sorted through them, I realized that many of them were not really relevant to my project at all. So I did what any good grad student would do, and I completely ignored the project for over 2 years. Then this summer, I prayed to the library gods, and an angel answered my call. Carol helped me define better search terms and reduce my data set of sources to about 550. Then I was able to screen out even more papers that were related to, for example, rainfall and survival, or temperature and nest success instead of precipitation. So ultimately, I ended up with 148 sources. So studies in our data set spanned all 7 continents, so we had pretty good geographic coverage. And there was a bias for the global north, but we did have a lot of papers that were from, pretty much all over the world. Our data set also included 64 species from 33 families, so pretty good phylogenetic diversity. And I'm not going to go into the details of all of the meta-analyses that I fit, but essentially I did a combination of vote counting analyses and more formal meta-analyses to account for phylogenetic non-independence. So if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it after the talk. But now for the results, I'm going to show a series of plots that look like this. So on the x-axis, we have the variable of interest, for example, precipitation timing. And then on the y-axis, we have the response to precipitation. So if it's near that dashed line, there's no response. If the point is above the dashed line, that's a positive response. So there's higher nest success in response to precipitation. And if it's below the dashed line, then there's lower nest success in response to precipitation. So we did find a clear relationship between the timing of precipitation and the observed response. So direct precipitation was associated with negative responses, while lag precipitation, or precipitation that occurred anytime before the start of the breeding season, was associated with positive responses. So the fact that both direct and lag precipitation was associated with these responses shows that there are both direct and indirect mechanisms underlying that. We also found that species with precocial chick development had higher nest success in response to precipitation, which makes sense because they are more developed when they hatch. We found that smaller species had lower nest success in response to precipitation, which is also what we expected. And species living at higher elevations had lower nest success in response to precipitation than those living at lower elevations, both at the level of daily nest survival and across the entire nesting period. And then contrary to what we expected, minimal nests had more positive responses and protected nests had more negative responses to rainfall. And another surprising result, that species with uniparental care had higher nest success in response to precipitation than cooperative care. We're not really sure why this is. Species in aquatic biomes had lower nest success in response to precipitation, likely due to flooding or physical destruction of the nests. And then we found no relationship between nest height and nest success following precipitation, and no relationship with diet breadth. So ultimately, we found that rainfall directly reduces nest success through thermogenic costs and physical nest destruction. Rainfall indirectly affects nest success, likely via the vegetation structure. And we didn't find any relationship between predator abundance or diet and precipitation. And this lack of relationship was pretty surprising because most papers cited diet as underlying everything, whether it was in response to precipitation or changes in abundance or nest success. So it could be that there are specific food types or diets that are more affected by precipitation, particularly if birds are seasonally limited or prey is highly variable each year. But these results suggest that future studies should investigate all of these mechanisms instead of just focusing on diet. These results also suggest that the species that would be most affected by precipitation are those living in dynamic biomes. So likely biomes with high variability in breeding season precipitation and vegetation that is highly responsive to precipitation. And one system that fits this mold is grasslands. So grasslands have high precipitation variability each year with periods of heavy rainfall during the breeding season, and vegetation that is highly responsive to precipitation, both in frequency and intensity over the course of several years. Along with weather variability, grasslands also fluctuate in response to other disturbances such as fire and grazing. And these disturbances are essential to maintain grassland systems and ultimately create variability on relatively fine scales. When you work in grasslands, you see differences in pastures just on one side of the road and the other because of differences in fire and grazing regimes, but you can also see how precipitation varies spatially. And sometimes one of your techs gets the short end of the stick. So no one else in our field crew got wet that day, but Liz was drenched. Along with disturbances that have been in grassland landscapes for millennia, grassland birds also face many other difficulties. So some birds might return to their breeding site and think that the pasture looks great, and then halfway through nesting, it gets hayed. So these are essentially ecological traps because they might look like good habitat for nesting, but the nests don't make it, and oftentimes the nest moms don't make it either. Also, conversion to agriculture. This makes grasslands not really habitable by grassland birds. And then also woody plants like trees and shrubs are encroaching on grasslands. And while trees might be good in other biomes, they produce a variety of threats for grassland birds. So not only do they decrease the grass cover that grassland birds need for nesting, but they also create refugia and perches for predators and brood parasites like brown-headed cowbirds that lay their eggs in grassland bird nests. And these threats are operating at massive scales. So the purple portions of this map are areas that have been converted to agriculture or are encroached by woody plants. The yellow areas are vulnerable to conversion because they neighbor croplands or areas with high densities of woody plants. Therefore, they're more likely to be invaded because they're near those seed sources. And then the green areas are intact grasslands. And this is a dire situation because we continue to lose these green areas every year. So because of this, grassland birds are the fastest declining guild of birds in North America. They're in that tan line at the bottom there. So almost 75% of grassland birds have declined in the last 50 years. So there's an urgent need to understand the population dynamics of these species so we can conserve them before it's too late. And not only are they experiencing huge declines, but they also have really interesting population dynamics in that each year their abundances might change by a lot. So this is an example of counts that were done along the same transect every year. And so these are counts of grasshopper sparrows. So in some years, researchers might see over 100 birds, and in some years they might only see 10 birds. So it's really interesting that these populations can persist given this variability. And this specific example is from the grasshopper sparrows at a site called Konza Prairie that many of us are familiar with. It's right outside of town here in Northeast Kansas, and it's an experimental site. So the pink areas are cattle grazed, the green areas are bison grazed, and most of the other areas are ungrazed, and they all represent different grazing and fire regimes. So we work on 13 of these units. We work on the patch burn grazed units, which means a third of those pastures are burned every year, and they're cattle grazed. And then we also work in bison and ungrazed units with fire return intervals of 1 to 2 years. And at this site, we study 3 grassland songbirds, the grasshopper sparrow, the eastern meadowlark, and the dickcissel. And I've been really fortunate to work on a long-term project that was part of our lab. We just concluded the 10th year this year, so we have an immense amount of data to work with. So as part of this data set, we would go out and set up these long mist nets. And at the bottom of the nets, we'd place a playback speaker to attract territorial males to the net. Then we'd go carefully extract them, take feather samples, blood samples, weigh them, take morphometric measurements and fit them with unique combinations of color bands. So then we can go out and recite them and see who's surviving each year and where they're selecting their territories. So through all of these efforts in the last 10 years, we have collected an immense amount of data. And I just want to put this up on the screen because this has been a lot of effort by Alice and other lab mates. And it's just, I'm very fortunate to be a part of this project. And along with these adult data sets, we also have nest data sets. So we go out and the grassland bird nests are super well hidden. So we drag long ropes across the prairie to lightly flush the nest females off the nest. And then we can go find where the nests are and monitor them over the nesting period to see how many young birds are fledging the nest. So again, we've monitored an immense number of nests. And I do want to make a shout out to Emily Williams, Sarah Winnicky-Smith, and Emma Winnicky-Smith, who put in a lot of time and effort to this. And so these data sets have led to 3 master's theses and 12 undergraduate projects. So I was really inspired by this pattern here, and I wanted to see how changes in grasshopper sparrow vital rates would impact overall population growth. So I wanted to see essentially how each vital rate was impacting the changes we see each year in this population. And just as a little bit of background, grasshopper sparrows are migratory grassland songbirds. So they migrate down to, our breeding population migrates down to southern Texas and northern Mexico for the winter before coming back up to breed every year. And across their entire range, grasshopper sparrows are declining really quickly. So for this project, we combined our nest data and our mark recite data, and we fit an integrated population model, which is essentially a way to combine multiple data sets and ways to make inferences about multiple vital rates. So we have fecundity, or the number of young produced per female, juvenile survival, adult survival, and immigration. So we estimated these 4 vital rates using the integrated population model. And this was a project that was led by a postdoc in my lab, Dr. Coley Freeman. So she was the one who developed this model and has been working with these vital rates. So I took these vital rates and I wanted to see how each of them contributed to changes in the population growth rate. So for each vital rate, one at a time, I increased it by 5%, and then I decreased it by 5%. And after each of those changes, I measured how the population growth rate changed in response to those 5% changes in the vital rate. So I did this to each vital rate one at a time. And we found that on the x-axis here, we have our vital rates, and on the y-axis, we have the percent change in the population growth rate, given a 5% change in the vital rate. And we found that consistently, the population growth rate was most sensitive to adult survival. So adult survival is driving many of the changes we see in the population each year. Next, Coley fit a path model. So essentially, she took these 3 weather variables: the number of storms throughout the breeding season precipitation 2 years prior, and average wet bulb temperature. And these were variables that she chose based on her knowledge of the system and her knowledge of bird physiology across all systems. And she wanted to see how each of them affected the vital rates in this population, and ultimately how those would change the population growth rate. And she found that the most influential of these weather variables was the breeding season precipitation 2 years prior. So this is what that relationship looks like. The population growth rate declines following heavier breeding season precipitation. So I took that weather variable and I projected the population over the next 80 years or so. And essentially, we found that the population is not expected to persist under future climate conditions. So each line is a different climate model. And then the yellow line is the average across all climate models. So in the next 50 years or so, those confidence intervals are overlapping a population size of 0. And these are optimistic estimates because they don't account for Lee effects or any additional stochastic processes. So this is the best case scenario. So we found that the population growth rate is negatively correlated with precipitation, which does not bode well for these birds under the expected variability of climate change. We also found that the population changes the most in response to adult survival, but we don't know why adult survival varies. So to understand why the population changes as a whole, we need to understand the mechanisms underlying changes in adult survival. So for my 3rd chapter, I studied what drives interannual apparent survival in grasshopper sparrows. So You'll notice here I use the word apparent survival and not just adult survival. That's because thus far we've been thinking of survival as either the birds are at the site or they're not at the site. So either they've survived and returned to the site, or if they're not at the site, they've presumably died. But there's a third option in that these birds could have emigrated. So they could have survived and left the site. So we use the word apparent survival to describe birds that have survived and returned to the site. But there are some birds that could have survived and left the site or emigrated. And then the third option is that they've died. So for this project, I wanted to understand of the individuals that don't return to our site each year, what proportion is due to movement versus mortality, and what drives variation in survival and emigration each year. So previous work by Emily Williams, who is a master's student in our lab, found that 50% of breeding males change territories every month during the breeding season, which is a huge number of birds that are moving around. So every single month, half of the males will choose a new territory. And that's within the season, but these birds also move around a lot between years. So we know that we have about a 26% return rate at our site, which means of the birds that we've banded in 1 year, we will only see 26% of them in any later years, whether it's the next year or 5 years later. We also know that about 9% of adult males skip at least one breeding season before returning. So about 9% of them might go somewhere else for a year and then come back to our site, which is pretty surprising for migratory birds that like to return to a site for the breeding season, and they want a known quantity because it's much safer for them to return somewhere that they are familiar with. We also know that 6 birds live to be at least 6 years old. So when we band adults, we know that they're adults, but we don't know the exact year of how old they are. So we know that 6 birds live to be at least 6 years old, but only one of those birds returned every single year, which is another interesting point. But this has also shown us the value of long-term studies, because if we didn't have enough years of data, we wouldn't have seen those birds return, and we would have just assumed that they died instead of emigrated to another site and coming back. So if they are returning in later years, we know that they're surviving. And by having this many years of data, we can make inferences about our detection rates and about how many birds are surviving versus emigrating each year. So because we know that precipitation variability drives many grassland processes, we wanted to test how precipitation might be linked with survival and emigration. When birds die, most of them die over the winter. So if precipitation is directly contributing to mortality, then we expected survival to be correlated with winter precipitation. If precipitation is directly influencing emigration, then we expected birds might be taking cues about where to settle when they return to breed in May, or relying on cues that they've gained throughout the previous year to make decisions. Therefore, we expected that emigration might be correlated with May or annual precipitation. Alternatively, birds might respond to habitat characteristics like vegetation structure. So plant composition at Konza each year is associated with spring precipitation. So we would expect a relationship between emigration and spring precipitation. Also, grasshopper sparrows like pastures that were burned 1 to 2 years prior, so they might be responding to precipitation that affected the vegetation structure even 1 to 2 years ago. And because these birds are moving around a lot, they might not only be responding to local precipitation, but also broader climatic indices like El Nino. And then finally, prey abundance might influence settlement decisions. So Ellen Welty, who was a grad student here several years ago, found a correlation between insect abundances and the North Atlantic Oscillation Index lagged 1 year. So if precipitation is driving emigration through the prey abundance, then we would expect a relationship between emigration and NAO lagged 1 year. So contrary to what we expected, survival actually increased with wetter weather over the winter. So SB is the El Nino Southern Oscillation Precipitation Index. So it is a climatic index that incorporates both temperature and precipitation. But we didn't expect that survival would actually increase with wetter weather. We also found that more birds disperse following wet or dry conditions. So about 63% of individuals emigrated each year, which is a pretty high number. But after years of intermediate precipitation, about 53% of them emigrated versus years of more extreme weather, about 70% of them emigrated. And again, this kind of lines up with what we would expect for birds that like pastures 2 years after they've been burned. It's likely that precipitation is affecting that vegetation structure over longer periods. So we do think that this relationship is mediated by the vegetation. So in total, we found that about 25% of adult males did not survive the winter. And of the ones that did survive, over 50% of them emigrated each year. So that is a pretty big number of birds that are not returning because of movement. And we found that rainfall can influence vital rates over relatively long time scales. So we've seen evidence in all of these chapters so far that precipitation is likely related to vital rates through vegetation structure, especially in this grassland system. So for my final chapter, I wanted to investigate the relationships between vegetation structure and grassland bird territory selection. So for my fourth chapter, I wanted to know what drives territory selection, which is essentially the opposite of emigration. So we studied our 3 abundant, highly dispersive grassland birds. So we know a lot about grasshopper sparrow movement now. We know a little bit less about meadowlark and dickcissel emigration, but all the evidence we have point to that they move around just as much. So we expected that vegetation and slope would drive their settlement decisions. These grassland birds need areas with tall forbs so they can perch and defend their territories. They need areas where the vegetation is less dense so they can easier find their food and find insects. But they also need areas with dead grass so they can form their nests. And we also expected that they would avoid areas with slope or with woody plants because these areas create a better vantage point for predators and areas where there are more likely to be brown-headed cowbirds that are brood parasites. So again, we used our Mark Resite data set in which we have bird observations throughout the entire summer. Then we also collected vegetation height and composition data. So we sampled vegetation at 10 points per unit once per month throughout the summer, through May, June, and July. We sampled the vegetation height and then the percent cover for each of these plant functional groups. So we ended up with bird observations throughout the summer and then vegetation samples just 3 times throughout the summer, but we didn't necessarily know what was happening between those vegetation sampling periods. So our bird observations didn't match up with our vegetation observations. So we decided to develop a model that predicted vegetation at any point in space and time so we could really make inferences about what those birds actually experienced. So we had our vegetation height and composition data that allowed us to make predictions across our study units. We also used an elevation data set to make predictions about slope. And then we had a data set of woody vegetation structure of woody plants that was created by Zach Radizak and Bryn Noble. So this allowed us to plug in the date and coordinates of any point in space and time, and then predict what the vegetation and slope looked like there. So we plugged in our bird observations so we can make inferences about resource selection. So this is kind of what it looks like. This is an example of June 1st, 2021, where we would expect grasshopper sparrows to select their territories. The areas in yellow means they're more likely to select territories there, and the areas in blue means that they're less likely to select territories. And we also wanted to know how well this model actually did at predicting where the birds would be. So we left out all of our grasshopper sparrow data from 2021 when we fit the model, so then we could go in and extract the model predicted probability of those actually observed territories. And we found that at the real grasshopper sparrow locations, the model was predicting a 93% likelihood that birds were there. And at a series of randomly sampled territories, the model was predicting a 35% likelihood that the birds were there. So the model performed pretty well. So what did we find? What factors drive grassland bird settlement decisions? First, we found that each species prefers different vegetation cover. So just as an example of what this looks like, on the x-axis, we have the percent of live grass, so just the plant functional type. And then on the y-axis, we have the probability of territory selection. And then grasshopper sparrows are in yellow, eastern meadowlarks are in blue, and dickcissels are in green. And we see that they're all selecting for different things. So grasshopper sparrows prefer areas with less live grass. Dickcissels prefer areas with more live grass, and then eastern meadowlarks don't really display a strong preference. But my point here is that all of those lines are crossing, and that is true for all of the other plant types as well. So this just shows the importance of managing for heterogeneous vegetation structure. We also found that all three species prefer relatively flat areas. So where that threshold is, where they're no longer selecting territories, is only a 20% grade. So those areas are 1 meter incline every 5 meters. So these birds really prefer the flattest areas. We also found that grasshopper sparrows and eastern meadowlarks avoid shrubs. So grasshopper sparrows and eastern meadowlarks prefer to be farther from shrubs, whereas dickcissels don't mind being a little bit closer to shrubs. But this makes sense because grasshopper sparrows and meadowlarks nest in the ground. They need to create their nests out of these woven dead grasses, whereas dickcissels usually nest in forbs, or sometimes they'll nest in shrubs that are slightly above the ground. So it makes sense that dickcissels are a little bit more tolerant of the shrubs. But when we look at the proportion of shrubs, we see that all three species prefer to be in areas with fewer shrubs. We also found that all three species avoid trees. So as you get farther from trees, they're more likely to select those areas. And as the proportion of trees increases, they very quickly avoid those areas. So even just when there's about a 10% cover of trees in their territory, they will not select that area. So if we know that they don't like woody plants, how would removing woody plants impact the likelihood of grassland birds selecting those areas? So essentially what we did is we went into our data set and just deleted trees to see how this would affect the likelihood of the birds selecting territories there. So I'll just show one example. So this is an aerial map of woody encroachment in an annually burned ungrazed pasture. And we see that overall the birds don't love that area. There's a lot of blue on that map. This is just because it's ungrazed. So the vegetation is relatively homogeneous. They usually prefer grazed areas where there is more diversity of their grasses and forbs. But there isn't a ton of woody cover in these plots. So most of the shrub and tree cover are limited to the riparian areas, and the uplands are still relatively clear. So when we remove one shrub island, we don't really see a huge difference. But when we remove one tree in this area, we do see a substantial increase in the probability of selection for these birds. I'm just going to zoom in on this plot here for scale. So this area, you can see that essentially one tree can have a pretty long shadow on grassland bird habitat. And not just on the plateau where the tree was removed, but also in the nearby plateaus. And this area is 28 acres just on this side of the border, but it's likely that there are areas on the other side of the road or the fence line that are also affected by this tree. So we found that removing one isolated tree can create over 28 acres of grassland bird habitat. And in areas with minimal encroachment, removing isolated woody vegetation had a relatively big impact on grassland bird habitat. But if a pasture has a lot of woody encroachment, more removal is necessary to see that impact. But from a conservation perspective, this is huge bang for your buck to remove one tree and be able to have an impact over such a large space. And these issues are time sensitive because woody plants are quickly encroaching grasslands in the Great Plains, and we are right in the middle of all of that. So this really is time sensitive. And while dispersal helps grassland birds cope with dynamic conditions, they are running out of habitat. So while we normally think of habitat loss as being converting a grassland area to croplands or a parking lot, woody encroachment is also a form of habitat loss for these birds because it fragments the landscape. But the good news is that most people who work in grassland systems agree that woody plants are a threat. And when a pasture is encroached by trees, this can lead to up to 75% reduction in cattle forage. So removing plants is beneficial for both birds and grazers. So whether you're a grasshopper sparrow or Baltimore oriole, much of your world is shaped by precipitation, both directly and indirectly. And throughout all of my chapters, we found some consistent patterns about the ways in which precipitation affects birds. So at the local scale, variation in local grassland bird abundance was largely driven by changes in vegetation structure, which is ultimately shaped by precipitation. And so all of these relationships influence a bird's decision to disperse each year. And this information sheds light on how we can best conserve these declining species now and under future climate scenarios. Movement can help alleviate the detrimental effects of precipitation. So whether you're selecting an area to breed that you think would increase your nest success, or if you're migrating to lower elevations during certain times of the year, birds can minimize the negative effects of precipitation and select areas that presumably increase their survival and reproduction. We also found no relationship between precipitation, diet, and vital rates, and this is one of the most surprising results. Many studies cite diet as the primary driver of animal abundance and behavior. And while this might be true in specific contexts, we didn't find any evidence for this at the local or global scale. And finally, precipitation timing affects the nature of the response. So direct rainfall often leads to negative responses, while lagged rainfall often leads to positive or curvilinear responses. But we also saw this seasonally. So grasshopper sparrows responded to the same metric at different times of year in different ways. And so this will have huge consequences as storm frequency and intensity are expected to become more variable in the future. So with that, I would like to thank a lot of people along with my funding sources. First of all, thank you, Alice, for taking me on when I didn't really have a lot of experience. We've been through a lot together, but we've also accomplished a lot. Thank you to my committee for all of your kindness and support over the past few years. I can only find one photo of all of us together. Thank you to all the Boyle lab members and field crews, both current and past lab members. And then the Division of Biology, a lot of important people who make our research possible. Everyone at Konza who is critical to maintaining experimental treatments and keeping everything running at Konza. Thank you to my friends and family for being so supportive over the past few years and always being down for a good adventure. And of course, thank you to my wonderful partner, Nils, for being supportive from both near and far. Throughout our relationship, we've been long distance for over 4 years. So I really appreciate you. And so does the Division of Biology. Even though you've never attended K-State, I love you.
Wow.
Okay. And I'm happy to answer any questions.